Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. All right. Yeah. Here we go.
So let's talk for a moment about this beloved disciple. In the Gospel of John, we hear of this character called the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. How to interpret that, and who is this person? So John chapter 21, verse 24, and remember, what is chapter 21? That's what the editor added in the end, because we couldn't stop the story after verse 20 because Peter had abandoned Christ. Chapter 21, we're going to have them all making up in the end. In chapter 21, verse 24, it states that the beloved disciple wrote this book. So who wrote the Gospel of John? According to John 21, 24, the beloved disciple wrote this book. Okay, so far so good? So then the question becomes, who is the beloved disciple? If the beloved disciple wrote this book, then who's the beloved disciple? Well, we hear other references to the beloved disciple in chapter 19, verse 26. We hear of this disciple whom Jesus loved. Chapter 19, verse 26, talks about this disciple whom Jesus loved. And in chapter 19, verse 35, it talks about this disciple being at the cross. At the cross in verse 26, Jesus saw his mother and the disciple there whom he loved. You see that, the beloved disciple? At the foot of the cross is not just Mary and the women. The other synoptic gospels told us that Mary and the women were there. Who is John introducing into that scene? The guy. Now that's fascinating. You follow me? These three stories didn't say anything about a guy being at the cross. These three stories said all the guys ran out of town. The only faithful ones left in the end were the women. What's John saying? Well, actually, it was the women, but there was one guy there too. Who was the guy that was there? The disciple. Ooh, does it say John?
No, but he was the only one that survived.
There you go. It says it's the disciple whom Jesus loved, who wrote this book, and what do we call this book? The Gospel of John. So people make the leap then that John is the beloved disciple. Do we believe then that John, that disciple, wrote this book? Remember again that it goes back to the same thing as with those letters of Paul, right? People were writing these books in people's name and in their authority. It was St. Irenaeus who attributed to John being the beloved disciple. So about the year 180, Irenaeus was suggesting that John the disciple was the beloved disciple, John the apostle. Others said, well, I don't know about that. Just because the Gospel of John was written by someone, maybe it was someone else. Maybe it was Lazarus. Think about that for a moment. Lazarus was risen from the dead. Maybe Lazarus was the beloved disciple. Or John Mark, who is the traditional author of the Gospel of Mark, since there are various similarities. Or maybe Thomas. Maybe it was someone besides John. So there have been different theories over time about who wrote the Gospel of John. Or
entonces cuando nos pregunten sobre los evangelios, puede uno decirse que ellos mismos vivieron todos con él, porque cuentan diferentes hechos.
can we say that the authors lived with Jesus or knew different things? Traditionally, Mark and Luke were companions of Paul, so they would not have known Jesus personally. They just had the stories. Matthew, if Matthew was really written by Matthew, then yes, he would have been one of the people with Jesus. The question for us as historians is, was the person who wrote that book really with Jesus? And that's where we don't know. The beloved disciple. So the question for us is, was the beloved disciple a certain person, or is the beloved disciple a symbol? Say a symbol for us or for good believers, right? Because you notice the gospel doesn't give him a name. It's just the disciple whom Jesus loved. Imagine for a moment that you are the disciple that Jesus loves. Then you are the one who's standing with him at the cross when everyone else runs away. That's a pretty powerful symbol. Imagine Deacon Cleophas standing up on Sunday. I mean, suddenly when they're talking about John was at the foot of the cross, wait a minute. If you don't say John, but the disciple that Jesus loved was there, then Deacon Cleophas' preaching takes a whole new direction. Are you the beloved disciple standing with Jesus at the foot of the cross when everyone else runs away? Are you the beloved disciple who runs to the tomb to see the risen Christ? The one who sees and believes. Remember when they get to the tomb, it's the beloved disciple who sees and believes. Are you the beloved disciple? If you see and believe, then you may just be that beloved disciple. So the question is it a symbol? Because we see how it is that this beloved disciple appears alongside Peter in scenes that are known to us from other Gospels, but they don't have the beloved disciple. And so if we wanted, we could open our Bible and compare these different stories where Mark tells the story about Peter, John tells the story about Peter and the disciple that Jesus loved. An example would be running out to the tomb. Who runs out to the tomb? Okay, maybe Peter runs out to the tomb in some of the other stories. In the Gospel of John, though, if Peter's running out to this tomb, he's not running alone. He's running out with the disciple whom Jesus loved.
He always just says the other disciple.
It just says the other disciple. Depending on your translation, does it say the other disciple whom Jesus loved?
It just says, on this book here, it just says the other disciple whom Jesus loved.
There you go. There you go. So depending on the translation, we have different translations, different ways that we translated those Greek words, but essentially simply meaning it wasn't just Peter running out to the tomb. In this book, it was Peter and the one whom Jesus loved. What are you like? When people tell you crazy, incredible things, are you one who sits back and says, yeah, yeah? Or are you one who believes? Are you a beloved disciple? How interesting, because in this gospel, the beloved disciple is not Peter. You know, we think of Peter as like being Jesus' favorite. No, not in this gospel. Is Peter the favorite in this gospel? No. Jesus had a beloved disciple, the disciple that Jesus loved. And we're not talking about Peter.
He just didn't want to give himself credit and name himself.
It could be. It could be that he was just referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Or that all these years later, that the Johannine school, who wrote all these other, produced all these other works as well, was simply using the disciple, the beloved disciple, as a symbol. Ultimately, the question, was the beloved disciple a person, or is the beloved disciple a symbol? We may never know. Other things that we know about the author of this book, we know that he or she was familiar with Palestine. Why? Because the Gospel of John tells us some things that none of the other Gospels tell us in terms of geography. For instance, it talks about where Bethany is located. You know what? We have no idea where Bethany was located. We've not found an archaeological site of Bethany, but the Gospels talk about Bethany, and John says where Bethany purportedly was. Interesting.
2 miles.
The garden across the winter flowing Kidron Valley. How interesting that it's almost like whoever knew, they knew certain details. It seems that they've been to Palestine. I mean, if they're talking about Solomon's porch in the temple, no one else has told the stories about Solomon's porch. Okay, how does he know about Solomon's porch? He or she must have been there. The pools of Bethesda and Siloam. What? A pool of Siloam? I didn't read that in any other stories. Okay? This person, if that pool existed, that person must have visited that pool. And the person was also familiar with Jewish feasts and with Jewish customs, because when the author talks about certain Jewish things, we have the sense that this person really had an idea of what Jews were like and what Jews celebrated and what Jews did.